Let's move on to the first of today's films about piano teachers, with, well, the utilitarianly titled The Piano Teacher. True.
Yes, which in the original French is just a pianist rather than piano teacher, but I'm not sure that particularly matters this time. It's more just my interest in the translation of titles. This one, less weird than usual. A little while ago in the podcast, we talked about the French film La Cérémonie, during which discussion Craig voiced his long-held reservations about the French. I demurred at the time, in part due to my personal experience with the French, but mostly because I reserve my reservations and suspicions for the Germanic peoples, it being generally only a matter of time before something weird or horrendously inappropriate happens. I don't think I'm ever getting their architect out of my memory, sad to say. Haneke is perhaps less directly to blame for that weirdness here in Le Pianiste, or The Piano Teacher, as it is, amongst his feature film work, unique in being the only work that is an adaptation rather than written by him. The source for this being a novel by the Nobel Prize-winning Austrian writer Elfriede Jelinek. Here is perhaps the opportune time to mention Haneke's personal philosophy, despite most of his TV films being adaptations, that adaptations of novels don't work, and that stories written specifically for cinema are the most successful as the two mediums are quite different. I don't entirely disagree with him, but there are of course exceptions, though I do agree with him in his belief that the writer, or writers, are by far the most important part of any film, and Haneke considers himself a writer more than a director. It is then little surprise that Haneke subscribes to auteur theory, something I myself largely do not, film generally being far too complex and collaborative a medium, but this director may be one of the exceptions. Certainly, despite it being an adaptation of another's work, The Piano Teacher is definitely a Michael Haneke film. The film itself is about Isabelle Huppert's Erika Kohut, the titular piano teacher, a French woman living in Vienna with her mother. This whole German weirdness thing begins early with the revelation that, for some reason, mother and daughter unnecessarily share a bedroom, who teaches aspiring adolescents to play piano, as well as teaching more advanced, talented students in a very competitive master class at the Musical Academy. One of these advanced students is Walter Klemmer, Benoit Magimel, an engineering student who, after becoming infatuated with Erika at a recital, gives up his studies to enter her master class. At the risk of sounding crass, that's not all he wants to enter, and he attempts to seduce Erika. Erika's own proclivities and tastes, most of which are in the realm of sadomasochism, prevent her from having a straightforward relationship with Walter, and he seems disgusted by her desires. It is generally bad form to yuck someone's yum, but it's hard not to here because Erika's pretty damn weird, beginning with sniffing the used tissues in a sex shop's viewing room and going on from there. In addition, she's also rather evil, cruelly punishing one of her students for the crime of being near Walter, but none of this excuses the ordeal that she is put through in the film's climax as a frustrated and angry Walter enacts a twisted version of the fantasies that she had confessed to him. Good is, of course, a particularly subjective term, but I'd argue that most, if not all of these films are objectively interesting, and A Piano Teacher is one such. It is not traditionally entertaining, and again, as you might have gathered so far, intentionally not so, and the ending may frustrate some people, but how do you end a film like this, about this complex, troubled and lonely person? The story is not neat because life is not neat. I watched a very interesting discussion, the one I mentioned earlier, with Haneke that was included in the Blu-ray for his most recent film Happy End, which we will talk about later, in which he described his approach to filmmaking and why he refuses to tie his narratives up in a satisfying little bow. He said, "In general, that's what bothers me about the cinema. The world gets explained, but the world is too complex and contradictory to be explained in a 2-hour film or 200-page book." That statement is something worth bearing in mind when watching or talking about the Austrian's films, I feel. To return to this film, Isabelle Huppert in particular is superb, and amongst the supporting cast there are many standouts, but most particularly Annie Girardot as Erika's controlling and supremely hateable mother. I can't say that I enjoyed The Piano Teacher, but I found it engaging and interesting, though I am puzzled as to the setting. Why is the film set in Vienna? The city plays little role in the events, and so too does the fact that Erica and her mother are immigrants, as all of the dialogue is in French. All that it provides is a chance for Haneke to work again with previous collaborators like Susanna Lothar and other German actors, and then have to very awkwardly dub them because they don't speak French. Bizarre, but otherwise good.
Yeah, I guess I didn't read anything in Vienna other than that's where the Vienna conservatoire is, and it's respected.
Yeah, but I don't know, it could be like Lyon or Paris or Brussels or Geneva or somewhere that speak French that wouldn't have really awkward dubbing.
Yeah. All I can really say about this is it's a film that I've watched. I'm left recycling the same kind of general criticisms. It feels like this should be a focused character study, and it just doesn't reveal all that much about the characters or their situations. So, again, I kind of get to the end of it and go, well, cool story, bro. It's all very well Haneke saying that he's frustrated by films that tie up all their narratives and try and explain the whole world in 2.5 hours. But I've never seen a film that's tried to explain the whole world in 2.5 hours. I've seen plenty that try and describe a small narrative or describe a character in 2 hours, and maybe you could take a crack at that sometime, because you certainly haven't done it in The Piano Teacher, where I'm kind of left with these interesting and compelling characters to watch, but ultimately I don't really... I get to the end of it and don't really know all that much about what's driving anyone involved in it. That's not to say I didn't find myself, again, liking is perhaps not the right term. I was certainly engaged by The Piano Teacher. It is a film that I don't think I'd ever watch it again, but I do not regret watching it in the slightest. And again, all those Haneke table stakes are there. It looks great, and all the production design is on point. Some, again, fabulous performances of sort of unlikable characters. And again, I'm not that hung up on the characters being unlikable. I just would have liked to have cracked open those heads a bit more and got a bit more of an idea of why they're acting this way, rather than just watching them acting this way and going, well, that's a bit weird.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sometimes you want a little backstory too. It's like I mean, there's a mention that Erica's father is in or died in a mental health hospital.
Yeah.
But a bit of background, like, why is she sharing this bed with her, or bedroom with her mother? That's weird. She's got a room there of her own in that house. It's big enough. I get the controlling thing, but that bit was weird. And I don't know. I want to know a bit more about the world and about these people.
I don't say and it happens in a lot of his work. I don't mind being left with unanswered questions, but I would have liked to have had the information to make some kind of educated guess about what the answers to those questions might be. Whereas at the minute in The Piano Teacher, I'm left kind of wondering if those questions were actually the right questions in the first place. There's a lot of, just a lot of things that are kind of left hanging, and I kind of can't really get a real handle on it. But for all that, it still somehow works. This is Haneke's style, and I guess you just kind of have to learn to roll with it by this point. And I think at this point I more or less had, so I was happy to kind of just go along for the ride and see what was coming up next. But yes, a very, very strange story for this, a very strange kind of love affair. Kind of. Interesting. Certainly, none of it rang kind of completely untrue. This felt like something that could happen, but yeah, it's just strange. That's my overwhelming review of this film. It's just a bit strange. Worth looking at, yes, certainly. As I said earlier, everything that Haneke has done, I would say, is worth looking at in some regard. But I'd maybe put this a bit lower down on the list than some of the other ones we'll get to. Yeah,
this is not my bottom of the list for this. But again, there's nothing in this that I didn't. I'm not going to use the word like. Some of them I did like, others there's nothing I didn't find interesting.
Yeah.
Some way engaging. And this is certainly one of those. It's just that, I mean, like, Erica's this troubled, suppressed, I guess, and I think desperately lonely woman.
Yeah.
Who potentially has the chance of a relationship, but in some way blows it, but maybe just well because he was clearly the worst of people.
Yes.
But at the same point, my sympathy is very much undermined by the fact she does that thing to the student with the glass in her pocket. And yes, people are complex, And it seems to be a fascination of Haneke. Going back to this interview again, it was called Masterclass with Michael Haneke, filmed in France with someone who I kind of feel was a bit like a real life version of Daniel Auteuil's character in Caché, but for film.
Right.
They'd written a book with before as well, but really interesting interview. And he mentions in that, you know, he's fascinated by, because you can't have everything wrapped up neatly because people are complex, and, you know, you might have a meeting with a person in the street and you come away really liking that person and find a couple of days later, but they were a murderer. So there's clearly some of that in here, even with this being an adaptation, although apparently quite different from the source. But still, when you have this quite sympathetic character and then undermine them so badly by having them just be evil at one point for not the strongest motivation.
Yeah.
It bothers me a wee bit. But also, Germans are weird. And you know what? I could quite happily have not had the scene where, you know, she's pissing for several minutes while spying on people having sex in a car. You know, like literally inches from them doing it, but them being unaware of it. I'm not sure that added anything. The sniffing of the tissues was probably enough to suggest, you know, she doesn't have your more kind of vanilla tastes. That'd have done. But yeah, it's still compelling. It's still really interesting. And Isabelle Huppert is superb in it. I think, you know, like this, and that, clearly I feel that there are lots to recommend, lots of these films, but even if in The White Ribbon the cinematography is enough, and this is probably Isabelle Huppert's performance is enough, if nothing else, to recommend watching it.
Oh yeah, absolutely.